At 23:41 on October 11, 2006, a radio transmission was intercepted over a monitored frequency in southern Afghanistan. It came from a compound near a district called Karash. The voice was calm, controlled, almost indifferent. "We have 800 fighters ready. Tell the British to leave. If they don't, we will remove them." There was no emotion in it, no attempt to sound threatening. Just a number. 800. In military terms, that number is not a warning. It is a conclusion. It represents a force large enough to surround, isolate, and destroy a fortified position without relying on speed or surprise. Standard doctrine suggests that to defend against a force of that size, you need at least 3 times the manpower. At Karash, there were 14. The message reached British command within the hour and was delivered directly to the officer responsible for the outpost. He was 39 years old, a veteran of conflicts that had nothing in common except one detail. In all of them, the numbers had gone wrong. Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Sierra Leone, Iraq, Afghanistan. He had operated in environments where planning collapsed, where support didn't arrive, where the outcome depended on decisions made under incomplete information. He read the intercept once, then again, then folded it carefully and set it aside. When he picked up the radio, he gave a single-word response. Good. No request for reinforcements, no attempt to delay, no sign that he had just been informed that an 800-man assault force was forming within striking distance of his position. The man who sent the message was known as Wallally. He wasn't known for dramatic attacks or reckless aggression. His strength was structure. Over 4 months, he had done something coalition analysts believed wasn't possible in that region. He had unified fighters from 6 provinces under one coordinated system. Helmand, Kandahar, Zabul, Farah, Nimruz, and Uruzgan. Different groups, with different loyalties, brought together not through ideology, but through logistics. Karash was not just a target. It sat on a corridor that functioned as a financial artery. Opium moved through it toward processing networks, while weapons, money, and personnel moved in the opposite direction. Control the route, and you controlled the funding. Control the funding, and you controlled the war. The British outpost had been interfering with that system for months. Patrols forced route changes, surveillance exposed movement patterns, and intelligence gathered there had already led to arrests inside Wally's network. Over time, that pressure stopped being a tactical inconvenience and became a structural threat. Wally understood that, so he decided to remove it completely. He didn't rush. For 4 months he prepared. Fighters were gathered from across the South and organized into a single structure. Sector commanders were assigned, approach routes studied, communications equipment sourced through black market channels designed to avoid interception. The operation was funded, supplied, and planned in detail. 800 fighters wasn't excess. It was certainty. And the transmission on October 11th was not a mistake. He wanted it intercepted. He wanted the British to hear the number before the attack began. In his mind, it gave them a final opportunity to make the rational decision. Leave or be removed. On the morning of October 12th, 3 Allied commanders met with the British major in charge of Karash. This was not an informal discussion. It was a formal briefing supported by weeks of intelligence. Satellite imagery confirmed movement along multiple routes. ground surveillance had identified staging areas within striking distance. Estimates placed the attacking force between 600 and 900 fighters, approaching along 3 axes, northeast, north, and east. Everything pointed to a coordinated assault. One of the American generals in the room had more than 30 years of experience and was not known for caution. But after reviewing the intelligence, he used a word he rarely used: indefensible. A withdrawal plan was presented. It was efficient, structured, and designed to extract all 14 men before the assault window opened. Equipment would be secured, personnel evacuated, and the position abandoned without unnecessary losses. The major studied the maps, the routes, and the projected timelines without interrupting. When the briefing ended, he pointed at the 3 axes of advance and said something that none of the commanders expected. They're not a problem. They're an opportunity. From their perspective, the statement made no sense. 3 directions meant pressure, encirclement, and no ability to concentrate defense. It meant being overwhelmed. But the major wasn't looking at the situation the same way they were, because while the intelligence had been built from satellites and surveillance, he had spent the previous nights outside the compound, walking the ground himself. He moved along each approach route in the dark, without thermal optics or aerial perspective, trying to understand how the attackers would actually move. He wasn't asking how many were coming, he was asking how they would arrive. Terrain does not treat large forces evenly. It compresses them, channels them, breaks their formation. A force of 800 cannot move as 800 through narrow ground. At certain points, it becomes 50, then 20, sometimes even less. He found 4 such points, not on a map, but in the terrain itself. Narrow corridors, broken ground, shallow depressions where movement slowed and became predictable. Places where numbers stopped mattering. He didn't plan to defend all 4 at once. That would have spread his men too thin. Instead, he built a sequence. Engage at the first point, slow the advance, force the attackers to deploy, then withdraw before being fixed. Fall back to the next position and repeat the process. Hit them again deeper along the route, where they expected movement, not resistance, then again, and again. The goal wasn't to stop 800 men in one place. It was to break them into pieces and control how those pieces moved. By the time the meeting ended on October 12th, the withdrawal plan had been formally recorded. It existed. It was ready to be executed. It would not be used. The major returned to his men. 14 operators, each with years of experience in situations where the numbers didn't favor them. He didn't brief them as a group. Each man was briefed individually. Position, route, timing, conditions for withdrawal. Every detail was based on what the major had seen during his reconnaissance. Hand-drawn maps replaced satellite imagery. Distances were memorized. Angles were fixed in memory. Nothing was left uncertain. At 2:17 on October 14th, thermal sensors detected movement at 1,400 meters on the northeastern approach. Not scattered figures, but a mass. The major had been awake for nearly 20 hours. He didn't hesitate. All positions, stand to. Within seconds, the compound shifted to full readiness. No noise, no confusion, no wasted motion. Each man moved to his assigned position, focused on the terrain feature he was responsible for. 3 axes, all active, exactly as expected. The northeastern column moved first, the largest and most important element of the assault. Behind it, more fighters waited for the signal to advance. What they didn't know was that the outcome had already begun to shift. Not at the compound, not in the command center, but out in the darkness, along the ground they were about to cross, where numbers would stop mattering and movement would decide everything. At 2:44, before the first exchange of fire, the most important action of the entire battle happened in a single shot. A two-man sniper team positioned along the northeastern approach identified a figure moving between the advancing fighters and a command element behind them. He stood out not by rank, but by equipment, the radio. The one man linking the front line to the commander. One shot, clean hit. He dropped instantly. In that moment, the northeastern column lost its ability to adjust in real time. The fighters at the front kept moving. They still had their orders. What they no longer had was control. At 2:51, the lead element reached the first terrain compression point, Alpha. It was a narrow section of ground where movement naturally funneled, forcing a large formation into a tight channel. The two operators holding that position waited until enough fighters committed into the space, then opened fire. The reaction was immediate. The front line tried to spread out, but the terrain didn't allow it. Movement became predictable, and predictable movement became easy to target. The engagement lasted just over 4 minutes, long enough to disrupt the advance and force deployment, but not long enough to be fixed. Then the operators disengaged and withdrew exactly as planned. From the perspective of the northeastern commander, nothing unusual had happened. A forward defensive screen had made contact and fallen back toward the main position. That was expected. He reinforced the lead element, compressing the distance between his forces to build momentum toward what he believed would be the decisive fight at the compound. He didn't know he had already entered the defensive system. At 3:12, the column reached the second compression point, Bravo. This one was tighter, a corridor no more than 30 meters wide. The two operators from Alpha were already there, joined by a third, in an elevated position covering the entire channel. The fighters entered with more caution, but they still entered. They had to. The terrain gave them no alternative that preserved their timing. As soon as the front ranks reached the center, the engagement began again. This time it lasted longer, about 14 minutes. Fire from above and from both sides locked the formation in place. Attempts to widen the formation failed. Attempts to push through only increased exposure. When the column pulled back to reorganize, the damage wasn't just physical. Cohesion was already breaking. Reports moving back were inconsistent. Some described multiple positions, others exaggerated the size of the defending force. Without a communication relay, the commander was working with fragments. He knew he had been stopped, but not by what. He still believed the main defensive line was ahead. He ordered consolidation and adjustment. It took over 20 minutes, time the British operators used to reposition again, moving further along the route to the third point, Charlie. At the same time, the northern axis began to unravel. A smaller force moving through broken terrain encountered a single operator who engaged briefly, then withdrew in a direction that didn't lead toward the compound. The fighters followed. It was instinctive. Contact draws movement. Without realizing it, they were being pulled off their intended route into ground that slowed them, stretched them, and broke their formation apart. What should have been a coordinated supporting movement was becoming fragmented. Back on the northeastern axis, the reorganized column pushed forward again, this time attempting to adapt. The formation widened before entering the next stretch, trying to reduce vulnerability. It was the correct adjustment and exactly the one anticipated. Because the third position, Charlie, was not inside a narrow channel, but beyond it, in open ground where spreading out increased exposure. At 4:47, the engagement at Charlie began. This was the most intense phase so far. More fighters were committed forward, increasing pressure from multiple angles. For several minutes, the operators holding the position were under sustained fire. On paper, this was where the numbers should have taken effect. But the sequence held. The defenders controlled timing, held just long enough to force commitment, then disengaged before being fixed. In the process, the Northeastern commander made a critical mistake. Under pressure and without clear communication, he pushed additional forces forward without coordinating with the other axes. The result was a gap in his formation, a break in control. The major, observing through thermal feed, saw it form but did not exploit it immediately. The plan was working. The force was not being stopped. It was being reshaped. By this point, the Northeastern column had lost more than time. Units that started together were now moving at different speeds. Command decisions were based on incomplete information. The assumption that the main defense was at the compound still held, but it was wrong. The defense had already been encountered multiple times. On the northern axis, the situation had degraded further. Movement through broken ground reduced speed and visibility. Internal communication was weakening. The formation was no longer cohesive. Fighters were advancing in fragments rather than as a coordinated element. The eastern axis, the reserve, was still waiting. In the original plan, it was meant to deliver the decisive push once the defenders were fixed. But that moment never arrived. Hours passed. Requests for updates produced nothing reliable. No confirmation of success. No clear picture of the situation. At 6:19, the Northern force finally approached what it believed was the outer defensive line of the compound. Instead, it encountered the full defensive capacity, repositioned and ready. The operator who had drawn them off course had already rejoined the defense. The engagement was short and controlled. Without coordination or accurate understanding, the northern element broke. Its commander was killed during an attempt to reorganize. The remaining fighters withdrew without structure. By first light, two axes had already lost cohesion. The third was still waiting for a signal that would never come. The plan that had taken 4 months to build was no longer unfolding as designed. It was reacting to something it didn't understand. And inside the compound, 14 men were no longer responding to the attack. They were directing it. By 8:30, the battle had already moved beyond what Wallally had planned. 2 axes had lost cohesion, one had collapsed entirely, and the only intact element left, the eastern column, was still waiting for a signal that no longer existed. In the original plan, that force was the reserve, the final push meant to exploit a weakened defense and finish the assault. Instead, it had spent hours staged in place, losing momentum, losing clarity, and most importantly, losing context. Its commander had no reliable information from the other axes, no confirmed assessment of the compound's condition, and no indication of whether the main effort had succeeded or failed. When the order finally came to advance, it wasn't based on opportunity. It was based on uncertainty. The eastern column moved at 8:34, approximately 140 fighters, the most intact formation remaining. Unlike the others, they advanced with discipline. Their spacing was controlled, their pace steady, their structure still holding. From a distance, they looked like the force Wallally had intended to deploy from the beginning. What they didn't know was that the conditions they were moving into had already been shaped against them. The Major had identified their approach route during his reconnaissance, and more importantly, he had identified where it would fail. The fourth position, Delta, was the most important point in the entire sequence. Unlike Alpha and Bravo, which relied on compression, and Charlie, which relied on exposure, Delta combined both. It was a shallow depression in the terrain that forced movement into a natural channel, while removing almost all effective cover. Any force moving through it would be visible for an extended period, unable to accelerate, unable to disperse, and unable to identify where fire was coming from, until it was already taking effect. The Major had spent the most time studying this ground, because he understood that if the eastern column reached it intact, this was where the fight would be decided. The operators assigned to Delta had been in position long before the eastern column began its advance. Ammunition had been pre-positioned. Distances were already known. Every visible feature had been memorized. There was no guesswork left. At 9:17, the eastern column entered the outer edge of the depression. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The formation continued forward, unaware that it had crossed into a prepared engagement zone. Then the first shots landed. The reaction was immediate, but incomplete. Fighters attempted to locate the source of fire, but there was no clear direction. The depression created overlapping angles, masking the exact origin of each shot. Returning fire without a target only increased exposure. Movement slowed, then stalled. The front elements tried to push through, but every step forward kept them inside the engagement zone longer. This was not a short contact like Alpha. It was not a contained disruption like Bravo. This was sustained. The engagement at Delta lasted nearly 2 hours. The Eastern commander attempted to adapt. He pushed additional fighters forward, trying to overwhelm the position through mass. It was the logical move. Under normal conditions, it would have worked. But this was not a normal engagement. The terrain removed his advantage. More fighters meant more bodies inside the same restricted space. More targets. More confusion. Less control. Without clear visibility of the defending positions, without accurate communication, and without coordination from the other axes, the assault began to fragment. Fighters at the front were operating independently, reacting to incoming fire rather than executing a coordinated push. Those behind them had no clear understanding of what they were moving into. The Major, observing the engagement, didn't issue unnecessary orders. The plan was already in motion. Each operator knew his role, his timing, and his limit. The key was control, not over the enemy, but over the sequence. At approximately 10:30, the eastern column reached its breaking point. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where the formation collapsed. It started with hesitation, then small withdrawals, then individuals pulling back without orders. At 11:01, the Eastern Sector commander moved forward personally, attempting to reassert control and push the lead element through the depression. It was a calculated risk. In situations like this, visible leadership can restore momentum. But it also exposes the command element. He was identified within seconds. The shot that followed ended the attempt immediately. With the commander gone, the structure that had held the eastern column together, disappeared. What followed wasn't an ordered retreat. It was instinct. Fighters at the front began pulling back under pressure. Those behind them followed without direction. The formation dissolved into movement without coordination. By 1200, all three axes had either stalled, fragmented, or withdrawn. Inside the compound, the situation was completely different from what Wallally had expected. The defense had not been fixed. It had not been overwhelmed. It had not even been fully engaged at once. It had been rotating, repositioning, and controlling the tempo of the fight from the beginning. The 4 terrain points, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta, had done exactly what they were designed to do. They had absorbed the attack, broken it into segments, and forced each segment to fight under conditions that removed its advantages. The number 800 had never been allowed to exist in one place. At 1244, attempts were made to re-establish communication with the northeastern element. There was no response. The commander had been killed during an attempt to reorganize his remaining fighters earlier that morning. Across all axes, command structure was either degraded or gone entirely. What remained of the assault force no longer functioned as a unified system. At 1328, Karim Wallally issued the withdrawal order. 35 hours after the first movement had been detected, the operation ended. The fighters began to pull back across the same ground they had advanced over during the night. But the conditions had changed. Darkness was gone. Movement was exposed. Coordination was minimal. What had been a planned assault turned into a retreat, shaped by confusion rather than control. Inside the compound, all 14 operators were still standing. The position had not been breached. The defensive line had never been reached. The plan that had taken 4 months to build had been dismantled in less than 2 days. Not by superior numbers, not by reinforcements, not by external support, but by control of terrain, timing, and decision-making. And the most important part was this. At no point during the engagement did the defenders try to fight all 800 men. They made sure they never had to. By 1402, the field was quiet, but the silence was deceptive. The eastern column had melted into the surrounding hills, leaving behind the wreckage of vehicles, abandoned equipment, and shattered morale. Small pockets of fighters tried to regroup, but the cohesion that had been painstakingly trained over months was gone. One by one, these pockets disintegrated under the relentless observation of the operators inside the compound, who now moved freely, securing perimeters, adjusting positions, and preparing for any delayed counterattack. What had begun as a massive assault of nearly 800 men had been reduced to scattered fragments struggling to survive. Karim Wallally, in a hastily assembled command post miles from the engagement zone, realized the scale of failure before any reports reached him. His carefully laid plans, meant to overwhelm and dominate, had collapsed not because of mistakes in execution, but because his enemy had operated on principles he had ignored: anticipation, timing, and terrain mastery. His trusted commanders were either dead, wounded, or missing, and the remaining fighters carried the inertia of desperation rather than strategy. Every attempt to rally a counteroffensive had been anticipated, every route of advance controlled, every margin of error exploited. The realization came too late. The major had never fought conventionally. He had never relied on numbers. He had relied on precision, patience, and psychological dominance. Inside the compound, fatigue began to show, but only in small, calculated ways. Operators rotated positions in silence, checking weapons, reassessing perimeters, and quietly recording what had happened. There was no celebration. There was no cheering. There was only a quiet, no cheering. There was only a quiet understanding that what had been achieved was extraordinary. They had faced a force 3 times their size, with multiple axes of attack. Yet, they had remained intact. Their training had been tested, their patience exploited, but their discipline had carried them through. By 1617, the first external reports began reaching the outside world. Journalists, embedded observers, and intelligence contacts described a collapse of the assault force without ever touching the core defensive element. The narrative was startling. A heavily armed and coordinated attack had failed without breaching the perimeter, without capturing a single operator, without even momentarily threatening command structure. Analysts would later call it a textbook example of force multiplication through control, timing, and strategic positioning. Yet at the time, the operators inside the compound didn't care about textbooks. They cared only about survival and maintaining advantage until the enemy fully dispersed. As night fell, the remnants of the assault began moving through the valleys and hills, trying to escape observation. Fires from abandoned vehicles still smoldered in the distance, a stark reminder of the cost of misjudging the enemy. In the confusion, reports of deserters began to surface. Communications were intercepted sporadically, revealing frustration, anger, and fear. Karim Wally's name was now spoken in quiet disbelief. The plan that had been unassailable had failed. The operators, however, remained calm. They had not engaged recklessly. They had not overextended. Every action had been measured, every risk calculated. They had allowed the enemy to destroy themselves through impatience and miscoordination. Casualty reports were minimal, not because the operators had not been attacked, but because their approach was never reactive. Every shot fired, every movement made by the attackers had been anticipated. Defensive fire was deliberate, controlled, precise. The major had structured the engagement so that each moment, each terrain feature, each angle of fire amplified effectiveness. By the time the enemy realized the depth of their failure, they were already scattered, exhausted, and broken in morale. When reinforcements arrived the following morning, they found the battlefield almost unnaturally quiet. No victorious shouting, no captured positions, no signs of celebration. Just remnants of the attack force scattered across hillsides and in small groves, nursing injuries and confusion. Analysts later called the engagement a perfect case study in the psychology of combat. Overwhelming numbers could not compensate for poor coordination, lack of information, and underestimating an opponent's tactical awareness. Every tactical misstep of the attackers had been magnified by the operator's preparation. Every hesitation had been punished. Every attempt to improvise had been countered before it became effective. In the aftermath, Karim Wally would attempt to salvage his reputation. Reports of unexpected resistance and terrain difficulties were circulated, but insiders knew the truth. His failure was total, systematic, and humiliating. The major, in contrast, remained anonymous for months, his operators blending back into the shadows, leaving no trace. The operation had ended, but the legend of what had occurred spread quietly within intelligence circles. Analysts debated the implications for months: how a small, disciplined, well-trained unit had defeated a force nearly 8 times its size through anticipation, control of terrain, and patience. The operators themselves did not seek recognition. They had survived, maintained operational security, and executed a plan with discipline. The real victory was in the method, the control of the fight from beginning to end. They had allowed the enemy to fight on their terms, exploit their own weaknesses, and collapse without requiring reckless action from the defenders. In later years, this engagement would become a standard reference in special operations courses, a lesson in patience, precision, and exploiting the psychology of the adversary. By the end of the 3rd day, the field was cleared. Reports confirmed the attackers had completely withdrawn, leaving behind material losses, fractured command, and shattered morale. The operators, having maintained the initiative throughout, withdrew in their own time, leaving no trace except for the record of what had occurred. The tactical and strategic lessons would echo for decades. Superior numbers were meaningless without control. Coordination was the true force multiplier, and a disciplined, patient, and anticipatory approach could turn almost any situation in favor of the prepared. This engagement would be studied, dissected, and debated, but the operators inside the compound never needed such validation. They had done exactly what they had trained for, controlled the fight, shaped the battlefield, and ensured survival without relying on luck. The assault force had come with confidence, planning, and arrogance. They left with disarray, doubt, and loss. And the quiet, almost imperceptible truth remained. It had never been a contest of numbers. It had been a contest of control, patience, and disciplined execution. And the victor had demonstrated it completely.